So the New York Times just published a lengthy report from Maggie Haberman and Jonathan Swan that gives us a behind-the-scenes look at the sheer panic and paranoia that consumed the Trump regime at the height of the Epstein scandal last summer. And even though I don't think any of it was particularly surprising, it was still really fascinating to me because it paints a vivid picture of Donald Trump's minions and how they operate, and gives you a sense of just how naive, incompetent, and amoral these people really are. You also learn about the depths that they were willing to stoop to in order to do damage control for Donald Trump, and interestingly enough, you also learn who they were willing to enlist in their propaganda effort. And Joe Rogan's name came up multiple times in this piece, seemingly because the Trump regime saw him as an extension of themselves, which is embarrassing for Joe Rogan and all of his fans, assuming he still has fans in 2026. But to give you some context, nobody on Trump's team seemed to care at all about the substance of the Epstein files. Rather, they treated it like it was a public relations issue, yet handled it with the severity that you would expect from a fucking national security crisis. I say that because they frequently met in the secure bunker in the Situation Room, the same one, by the way, where this photo was taken of Obama's team during their mission to take out Osama bin Laden. That is how serious they were taking this PR crisis. And I think that that context is important because it speaks to how important Trump's reputation was to them. And that is a recurring theme throughout this piece. And the article never explicitly states this, but the subtext is that they had to make him look good to stay in his good graces. It was their main job, essentially. That's what they were there to do, not advise him on how to represent and serve the American people, but to make him look good. It's embarrassing. But these meetings, they were embarrassing for a different reason, because they were cooking up devious scheme after devious scheme to placate the MAGA base and get the public off of their backs. And that's where Joe Rogan's name came up. So then Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche recommended a searchable database for the Epstein files, which they did eventually create, even though the earlier version was scrapped. And we never really knew why they created this database, because some of the things in that database was genuinely damaging to Donald Trump, but the goal was to flood the zone, as we now know. Haberman and Swan explain, quote, "The conversation turned to how these files should be released to the public. The idea already in the works was to put all Epstein-related material on a website. That way, they could overwhelm the magosphere with far greater volumes of real information in the form of a huge database. They planned to release it all. Blanche could then appear on Rogan's podcast to promote the transparency from the White House." So you can see how Rogan was integral to their plan to placate the MAGA base. And to be clear, around the time when they were considering this particular strategy, it finally became evident to most of them, after a lot of denial, that the Epstein scandal wasn't going to go away, so they had to do something to satiate the demand for more information from MAGA diehards. And even though they didn't go with the original version of their database, they did later release one database with thousands and thousands of documents, many of which were heavily redacted. But nonetheless, there was still a lot of damning things in that database about Donald Trump that people found. And I remember asking myself at the time, why would they do this? And I suspected that it was either due to incompetence or because they wanted to overwhelm people by just releasing a bunch of stuff at once in order to dilute the potency of the most scandalous revelations. And it seems like that was indeed their goal, which they'd then top off with an appearance on the Joe Rogan Experience to jerk themselves off about how transparent they were being after months of zero transparency. It is quite the revelation. But the question is, was Joe Rogan willing to let them use him to shield themselves from fury over their handling of the Epstein files? Would he actually try to help them clean up the mess that they made? And it seems like the answer to that question is yes, although, to be fair to Joe Rogan, he did have some conditions. So at a different meeting, the authors explain, the vice president once again pushed to release as much of the Epstein files as possible. And with an eye on the public messaging, he proposed that he should be the one to appear on Rogan's influential podcast. Vance had just gotten off the phone with Rogan, and he later told others that Rogan said he wouldn't have Blanche on his show, but would take Vance. Vance argued that if he were the one to appear on Rogan's show, then only a part of the conversation would be about Epstein. The rest of the interview, he told the group could be about the president's recently passed legislation and what it would do for working families. In other words, Joe Rogan agreed to work with the Trump regime's cronies to help them do damage control and help them survive the Epstein firestorm. So he was willing to be a de facto state TV propagandist at their beck and call, which calls into question, of course, his independence as a commentator. Sure, maybe he'll criticize Trump here and there with the kid gloves on, of course, but this report exposes him as a regime lackey who's willing to play ball in the event they need his platform to bail them out of a tough situation. But to be fair to Joe Rogan, J.D. Vance didn't end up going back on his podcast in 2025, to my knowledge. So the plan to exploit his platform for damage control seemed to have fallen through. And I do think that there's two possible reasons for this. One, because Joe Rogan actually came to his senses maybe and realized that it was a bad look and downright immoral to run interference for a regime embroiled in a pedophile scandal, which is a possible explanation seeing as how he platformed Kash Patel a couple of months earlier, and Patel's lies about the Epstein files did not go well with Joe Rogan's audience. They fucking hated it. So if that happened again, Joe Rogan could potentially jeopardize his own integrity with his right-wing audience. But the second possibility is that Rogan might have thought that it would be a little bit too obvious what he was doing if he brought on the vice president to try to do damage control about the Epstein files. And maybe he thought bringing on somebody less close to the regime that would still downplay the Epstein files no less, would be more subtle, the more indirect way to get the message across. Now, I don't know what the answer to that question is, but regardless if Joe Rogan came to the rescue or not when they wanted him to, he has helped to sanitize the image of Epstein's associates, either wittingly or unwittingly. I say that because Joe Rogan's own fans started to notice how he kept platforming people in the Epstein files. Peter Attia, Peter Thiel, Reid Hoffman, Lawrence Krauss, not to mention Elon Musk and Trump himself, and the American Redacted YouTube channel pointed out these bizarre decisions in a video that they published in February.
So now that people have had a few days to digest the millions of emails and documents linked to Jeffrey Epstein, it's now starting to appear that Joe Rogan's had a lot of people on his show that are now confirmed to have been closely linked to the predator and criminal himself. Joe Rogan's platformed more than 9 different people and counting at this point, who were named in the files sometimes thousands of different times. It all certainly raises more than a few questions.
Now, to be fair, Joe Rogan platformed these guests before the height of Trump's Epstein scandal, but with that being said, there was already ample evidence when he interviewed these guests that they were indeed implicated in the Epstein files in some way, shape, or form. Yet, as American Redacted explains, Rogan went out of his way to run interference for them anyway.
When you were introduced to him, how was he described to you?
He was described as one of the smartest tax people in the world.
Interesting.
And I probably was my moral weakness that I.
Well, how could you have known back then? He had never been arrested.
No, this was 2014. It was post arrest.
Oh, so his arrest was the first arrest, right?
Yeah,
which was like 2000.
07, 08.
Okay.
Upon learning this, though, Rogan doesn't even think twice before making excuses for Thiel, saying that he knows a lot of people who were tricked by Epstein, instantly letting Thiel off the hook.
But I thought he always had good judgment in people.
When the shit went down and Epstein gets arrested for the second time, were you like, oh, well, there you go?
I've thought about it. I thought a lot about it as a result, yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure. Jesus Christ. Well, he tricked a lot of people. I know a lot of people that met that guy.
So that right there is the very reason why so many of these elites just love going on Joe's podcast. Because Joe's best friends with whoever's across the table with him that day. And he was probably so starstruck by Thiel and his connections that he never even thought to second guess the guy on his relationships with Jeffrey Epstein. Believe it or not, Joe's literally platformed Epstein's personal chef, Adam Perry Lang, who worked for Epstein for 4 years straight back in the late 90s, flying with him on his private jet to cook for him at Epstein's various different properties, including the infamous Epstein Island. And this was all public information prior to that podcast, so it was pretty strange that Joe didn't bring that up once. There was even an article written about it.
Yeah. Now, to be clear, nobody's accusing Joe Rogan of any wrongdoing, but if he was already personal friends with so many Epstein clients or associates, it's not surprising that J.D. Vance would see Joe Rogan as a useful idiot that would also willingly sanitize Donald Trump's image as well, since he already did that for Peter Thiel and Peter Attia, presumably for the love of the game. And what's even more embarrassing for Joe Rogan is that J.D. Vance also floated the idea during one of these meetings of getting Tucker Carlson to, get this, interview Ghislaine Maxwell, seemingly so that way she could publicly clear Donald Trump of any wrongdoing, as if we would believe anything she had to say. Now, there's no confirmation in the article that Vance actually made contact with Carlson about this particular interview, but as we now know, Carlson has fully broken with Donald Trump, whereas Joe Rogan, to this day, has not, despite criticisms that he may have of the regime here and there. So if Tucker Carlson, a paid propagandist for the right, is going harder against Donald Trump than Joe Rogan, who's ostensibly independent, what does that say about Joe Rogan? I think it says that he's not independent. He's not neutral. He's a right-wing stooge for all intents and purposes. And I think that he should feel deeply ashamed now that we all know that this far-right fascist regime thought that they could use him for their own purposes. That is deeply embarrassing. But the Joe Rogan stuff is just the tip of the fucking iceberg in this article, because there was an active effort by the regime to gag right-wing podcasters who were still pushing for the release of the Epstein files, including the late Charlie Kirk. The authors continue, on July 12th, the president took to Truth Social to defend Pam Bondi against criticism and to urge his boys and gals to stop wasting time and energy on Jeffrey Epstein, somebody that nobody cared about. More on this in a moment, by the way. Trump told aides he was very unhappy with some of his most influential supporters, including Charlie Kirk, Tucker Carlson, and Megyn Kelly, all of whom were publicly urging the administration to come clean. Kirk had held a Turning Point USA event the previous day that turned into an Epstein grievance fest, with one speaker after another bashing Bondi over her handling of the situation. Trump had called Kirk and scolded him. And Trump's pressure seemed to have worked, because days later, Charlie Kirk made this announcement on his podcast.
I'm done talking about Epstein for the time being. I'm going to trust my friends in the administration. I'm going to trust my friends in the government to do what needs to be done, solve it, balls in their hands. I've said plenty this last weekend.
Now, that's not the only time that Trump directly pressured somebody to shut up about Jeffrey Epstein, but when he did this, it didn't always work, as it did with Charlie Kirk. He also pressured Marjorie Taylor Greene, as we now know. He told her that they can't come out, can't release the files because it hurt some of his friends. And him, probably. He didn't say that, but, if you read between the lines, that's part of it, because when has Trump cared about anybody but himself? Now, on top of that, before the Wall Street Journal released their story about Donald Trump's birthday message to Jeffrey Epstein, the article talks about how he did everything he could to bury that story. He threatened to sue them, which he later then did, and he even accused them of hating America if they published the story. And what was so striking to me in this article was the tension between Donald Trump and his lackeys when it came to how this should be handled, because Trump's cronies, including J.D. Vance, they wanted to just rip off the Band-Aid and release it all so that way they could put the issue to bed, but Trump wasn't having it for reasons, we'll say. Now, the author's right. There was one major obstacle in the path of a solution. The president himself still had no interest in transparency. He wanted the whole Epstein issue buried, and he was snapping at anyone who mentioned it. His staff largely avoided the subject in their conversations with him, forced to worry among themselves. Yeah, because I'm assuming it was a bit of a sore subject for him, for reasons. And if you'll remember, he tweeted about how it was a hoax and any one of his supporters that were still chirping about Epstein were past supporters, basically disavowing people who voted for him if they wouldn't shut the fuck up about Jeffrey Epstein. But behind the scenes, his cronies were trying to help him in any way they could, even though every single thing he was doing was making their jobs harder, because it was so fucking suspicious. Like, he was acting in a way that somebody who's guilty would act for reasons. But no matter how hard they tried, they simply could not thread the needle in a way that would satisfy both Donald Trump and his base, given his defiance. And trust me, they tried really, really hard. Todd Blanche, for example, was the one that came up with the idea of calling for the release of grand jury testimonies in the old Epstein trials, because that wouldn't necessarily yield any new information that would damage Donald Trump. And on top of that, it would be pretty difficult to get the courts to unseal that information, which Todd Blanche hoped would happen, because then he would be able to shift blame from them to judges, ideally Democratic ones, to deflect culpability, right? So that was the situation he was trying to come up with. But I mean, as you now know, none of those attempts to placate the base worked. And behind the scenes, they were all losing their fucking shit over this because it was almost impossible to cover this up and because Donald Trump was making their lives hell. And I'm glad that he did that, but it's just gross that they're still complying and trying to do this. Now, the article explains how, in spite of their bravado, it was paralyzing the regime behind the scenes, with his cronies forced to try to reconcile this dispute between him and his own base. And things got downright heated, where it really started to set in that this was not going to go anywhere, and it culminated in Dan Bongino going off on multiple people within Trump's regime. And the article paints Bongino as probably the most savvy, dare I say, reasonable person, albeit for self-serving purposes. But I just want to read to you an extended excerpt that shows you how scorched earth he went behind the scenes. So during a confrontation with Pam Bondi, they report that Bongino said, "You fucked this thing up from the start," Bongino yelled at Pam Bondi. "The way you've been talking about this, that dumb fucking charade with the Epstein files, that they're on my desk nonsense, all the promises to the folks out there." Patel and Bongino both subsequently told the White House official that Bondi needed to resign. And it's embarrassing because the original memo that kind of started this shitstorm in the first place, Bongino didn't support that, but Patel was like, it's not a great idea, but go ahead and do it. So he's trying to bury her for something that he could have stopped as FBI director. But to get back to Bongino, he was so pissed off that he leaked a story to ABC News, and then they caught him. So Susie Wiles, Trump's chief of staff, confronted him about this days later, to which he responded, "I'll tell you what," Bongino replied, "I'll give you $100,000 cash right now. I'm not kidding. Walk out to the West exec, put that reporter on speaker, and get him to admit I leaked it. $100,000. Wiles snapped back, "Well, we all got ourselves into this." Bongino cut her off. No. We didn't get ourselves into anything. I warned you guys about this the whole time, and you ignored me. And exactly what I said was going to happen happened. And now you're pretending I was in on this. I was never in on this. Bongino's aggressive response to Wiles startled others. She was the White House chief of staff, essentially a stand-in for the president. Wiles put Bongino on the spot. Going forward, she said, "We're all in. We're all going to agree to move forward. Are you in or not?" "No, I'm not," Bongino said. "This is not my plan. I'm not part of this going forward. Forget it. I'm out of here." He stormed out of the Situation Room and onto West Executive Avenue, where he climbed into the back of Patel's armored SUV and directed the driver to take him to FBI headquarters. I would have loved to be a fly on the wall during these arguments. Now, in some ways, I'm sympathetic to Dan Bongino because it's true that he was one of the people who tried to warn them. Susie Wiles was one of these folks that was like, listen, this is all going to blow over. This Epstein thing is not really a big deal. Trump weathered so many other storms, so he's going to weather this storm too. And Bongino tried to convince her that that's not actually the case. This is a scandal that's different and could harm him, but they didn't listen to him. So I understand why he was so frustrated, because now he looks like shit because of the administration's mishandling of this. Now, there was speculation at the time and hope among Bongino's friends that he would resign at that point when they had that argument, because he felt like he'd been thoroughly discredited because of the regime's handling of the Epstein files, rightfully so, seeing as how he was one of the people who beat the drum the loudest about Trump releasing the Epstein files before he worked for the regime. And he later lamented how he basically lost everything. He gave up everything because of the way the regime handled the Epstein files. He gave up his $1 million podcast to work for Donald Trump, and now he lost it all because they completely blundered it. So given those feelings, you would expect him to be angry and just straight up quit right then and there, right? Because when you read this, it looks like that's where it's headed. But he actually didn't quit then and there. Like, he ended up resigning eventually, but the regime convinced him to stay on at least a little bit longer because they thought it would look really bad for Donald Trump if Bongino resigned at the height of their Epstein controversy. And Bongino decided to do just that for the sake of Donald Trump. Explicitly. He's like, yeah, I'll do that. So in other words, he risked tarnishing his own reputation in order to spare Donald Trump's reputation. I mean, that is the level of sycophancy we're dealing with here, from the most sympathetic person in this entire piece. And the obvious question is, why are people so loyal to a man implicated in a fucking pedophile ring? And the answer is because they never really believed that there'd be anything too damning about Donald Trump in the first place. And when they finally discovered red flags in the Epstein files about Donald Trump specifically, they just didn't care. In fact, they were debating how the public would react to a particular allegation they found about Trump's nipple flicking fetish that was revealed by Epstein accuser Sarah Ransom. Quote, in the emails, Ransom claimed that she knew a girl in Epstein's sex trafficking ring named Jen who said she had sex with Donald Trump. Ransom also claimed that Jen had told her that Trump had a predilection for nipples and that he had aggressively flicked and sucked hers. Ransom wrote that she had seen evidence when she shared a bathroom with Jen. Quote, they looked incredibly painful and they were red and swollen, and I remember wincing when I looked at them, she wrote. Blanche argued that in context, the Ransom document and Ransom's disavowal of some of her other claims would make clear why the allegations related to Trump had never been pursued for prosecution. Besides, these allegations were already available online because of what had been unsealed, so there was no reason to leave them off the Justice Department website. The vice president said he thought the president would be okay with releasing the nipple-related documents, arguing that Trump had been accused of worse. Quote, I think we should put it out, he said. It would cause people to say we're going further than we need to. Wiles quickly responded that the president would not, in fact, be okay with it. It was a point no one wanted to continue debating. One official will later describe it as a surreal experience to be discussing nipples in the White House Situation Room. Yeah, I bet. And the way that they talk about it in such a cavalier manner is actually really nauseating, because you're not just discussing a potential kink that the president has. It's not merely embarrassing to the president. You're discussing alleged physical abuse of a victim of sex trafficking by your fucking boss. This is an Epstein victim that we're talking about here. And I'm not sure what the age of this victim was when it happened or whether or not it was consensual, but the way that they didn't even consider the pain Trump may have forced her to endure really speaks to how sick these fucking people are. And the irony is that they thought this wouldn't be taken seriously because Sarah Ransom isn't a credible witness in their eyes since she retracted her claims about Epstein, but she later explained that she did that because she feared for her safety. But they saw that as a persuasive excuse to save Donald Trump's ass because they very clearly didn't care about the victims, even though one of their excuses for not releasing the Epstein files in the first place was that they wanted to protect the victims. Which is so ironic because behind the scenes, we now know they were treating Trump like he was the only victim based on how they prioritized getting this to go away as quickly as possible above everything else. And that's the key takeaway, I think, from this story. And it tells you exactly why Donald Trump picked all of these people. Because their loyalty to him is truly unconditional. But again, we already knew that. It's just a little bit surreal to see how unwavering they really are behind the scenes. And Epstein's ex-assistant told members of the House Judiciary Committee that she used to set up quarterly calls between Epstein and Trump. And she said that this week. And we all now know that his cronies aren't even thinking through the implications of that close relationship between their boss and Jeffrey Epstein. Rather, they're already trying to think of ways to downplay it because they clearly have no qualms with working for an alleged pedophile. Hell, I'm convinced that they still wouldn't care if they saw a video of Donald Trump committing a crime of that nature. Because, I mean, they've already sold their souls to him. So there isn't anything that Trump could do that they wouldn't defend. It's truly despicable. So if you know someone who still supports Donald Trump in 2026, this is the sickness that they're choosing to overlook. It's not complacency or ignorance. It is a choice that they are making. They're choosing to support Donald Trump still throughout all of this, and that speaks to their moral bankruptcy.
Do yourself a favor and click the join button on YouTube to become a member. Because Mike's doing a great job getting to watch his videos before everyone else is tremendous. Many people are saying this. Join today, folks. You won't regret it.